Hello and welcome. I'm Jay.
And I'm Robbie.
You're joining us for episode 12 of Generations Apart, the podcast where we talk about gaming and tech across the generations, sharing our excitement for the future and our perspectives on the past. On today's episode, we're revisiting the past. In fact, 10 weeks ago, when we first talked about generative AI, a subject that has continued to grow in popularity and in excitement from a technology perspective throughout 2023. It's only been 10 weeks. We want to chat today about how much has changed in such a short period and where this might be going for the rest of this year and beyond. Before we get into that though, Robbie, what piqued your interest this week?
So this week, I'm revisiting a topic we've chatted about before, which is gaming on Apple Mac computers. And there's been a development which has piqued my interest. I was very excited in that episode chatting about gaming on Macs and how it's not quite there yet, but there's more and more developments. And this is more, again, around the Apple Silicon, so their own chips that they've developed for their computers. It's not quite there yet in terms of the developers making games for them. So there's lots of workarounds that developers have been creating. And you might remember we chatted about using Boot Camp on the old Mac computers where it was Intel chips as opposed to their own, where you could log off and reboot the computer as a Windows laptop just by going into the BIOS and changing that around. That is still not available, but what is available is you're able to do that now with Linux. So it's a bit like how Boot Camp, when you could shut down your MacBook and turn it back on as Windows. Instead, you can do that with Linux. And there's been some developers working very hard to connect or mash up the APIs between the hardware on the Mac computers from the Linux side of things, so that they can take advantage of the graphics performance that's built into the Apple Silicon. And they've come up with a version that seems to be working for at least a good chunk of games now. And Linux has what's called a Proton compatibility layer, so that you can use Windows games through Linux. And it's what I use actually on my I have a Steam Deck which also runs on Linux, and there is more and more games that are running natively on Linux, which is fantastic. But for those that aren't natively run on Linux, there is that compatibility kind of tool that you can use called Proton, which translates the architecture for games from Windows into Linux. So all that to say, new development for Apple Silicon gaming, and it's now you can play the Linux games on Mac computers, which opens up a whole lot of games that wasn't able to be played on them before.
So maybe there is a desire then, which I questioned and doubted in our last episode. Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge communities behind this, and I know it's hard to, if you're not close to it, or if you don't see it talked about very often, it's hard to imagine that there is a market for gaming on Mac computers. But I mean, there's tons and tons of content about it on YouTube. There are obviously developers working really, really hard to try and get this working through various other means, like this using Linux. So yeah, there is a market there, I'm telling you, I promise.
No, and I guess it makes sense. There's a lot of people now, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, that have pivoted from traditional Windows devices to MacBooks. They're more present than ever. I mean, you've only got to walk into your local Starbucks to see how many people, certainly in that environment, are sat there working away on a MacBook rather than a Windows laptop. So, yeah, I guess if the audience is there, it's exciting that people are making progress. I still think it's far too much effort at the moment for your everyday Joe to probably go through to get this to work. You've got to be quite confident and willing to spend the time, by the looks of it, to kind of get your Mac running Linux and then get all this kind of stuff working. But like you said, if you've got the appetite and you've got the technical capabilities, this stuff is moving forward. And I guess this is the obvious first step in bringing this to your more casual audience, because it will be, if the desire is there, as you say, and that demand does exist, they'll find ways to simplify it. They'll find ways to commercialize it. And then, people like me who've lost the interest in tinkering under the hood will be able to get this stuff very easily and make it work for them without the sort of effort that you might otherwise have to go to.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's definitely worth noting. It's not easy to get this working, as far as I can tell from the video. And I'm not sure how easy it was to get Boot Camp running on MacBooks back in the day, where you could have Windows running on Macs.
It was all baked in well, I think for the people who originally made it work, probably not very easy, but once it was made to work and Apple adopted it, it was baked into the Mac OS. You could just do it through the Mac OS sort of back end. So it was really easy. I could do it, so it must be really easy. So,
not quite there yet, but how exciting. Further developments. I'm one step closer to getting a Mac now, see.
I do wonder if this is you just trying to find an excuse to make that purchase.
One day.
Just that buy button, it's there. It's calling to you.
All right,
well,
then,
I'm
Jay,
going to break with tradition.
what's your piqued interest?
Well, it's a good question. And I'm going to break with tradition because normally I inadvertently find a way to link the thing I'm talking about to the topic of the day. Today, that couldn't be further from the truth. I want to talk to you about Super Mario.
Nice.
For two reasons. First of all, I have seen the new movie, and I wanted to just talk about that very briefly for those who are interested. I appreciate we're not a movie review podcast, but it's cool, it's nerdy, and I'm interested in it, and it's gaming, so I'm going to cover it. The other thing I wanted to talk about as well was, as mentioned, I think previously on one of our other episodes, I had the opportunity for my 40th birthday to go to LA and San Francisco for a big birthday treat and a bit of a nerdy trip where I got to do all sorts of bucket list things that I've wanted to do for a while. One of those things was to visit Universal Studios in LA, where they've not long opened the Super Mario Land or Super Nintendo Land.
That's right. It was one of your piqued interests,
ride.
I think, on an earlier episode.
It was. So that was. So it's open now, obviously, because I went, and I arrived at 7:30 in the morning. Jet lag enabled me to get up super early, and me and my wife made our way to Universal. We queued. It opened at 8 o'clock. It was absolutely packed. We power walked through the park to get into Super Nintendo World. I did some quick videos as I sort of flew through the warp pipe that you go through to enter the land, and then very briefly took a moment to take in the experience before blasting into the Mario Kart queue, which predominantly sits at around the 180-minute mark, which is horrific. So I didn't want to queue in that. I wanted to get it done as fast as possible. I think we ended up spending 20 minutes in the queue to get on this ride, which was perfect because that was as much as I was prepared to do because I had a limited amount of time in these locations before I had to come home. And we did the ride. We rode the Mario Kart ride. It was really good. I'll be honest and say it wasn't the best ride experience I've ever had. I've been fortunate enough to do Florida and Universal Studios there, as well as obviously all the Disney parks. There are much better rides out there. But it was an interesting mix of a traditional ride mechanic and technology. So I don't know if you've heard much about this one, Robbie, but I'm going to tell you all about it.
I think you did mention. Yeah, there's some really cool.
So it uses augmented reality basically, and it's so you drive it. You get into this large, oversized Mario Kart with sort of 3 other people. You wear these what I would describe as being a bit like the kind of ratchet system on the Quest Pro. It's like very much like a headset, but it had a Mario cap at the front.
Nice.
With the little red M, and then underneath were a set of magnets. And when you got into your car, you clipped the AR headset onto this frame, and then it held it where it needed to be for the duration of the ride, and you put it back on the ride at the end. So for the queuing process, one of the stage gates for the queue is to hand out these headsets. So there's a point where there's a good 50 to 60 people or more, possibly, just all stood around together in a queue wearing these ridiculous kind of half Mario hats with these brackets going around their heads. You get on the ride, you clip the AR screen in, and there are some buttons on the steering wheel, and effectively the ride kind of takes itself around the track. So there's no real navigation that needs to be done by you, although you've got a wheel and theoretically you're driving. What you're actually doing is you're moving the wheel in time with the track to score points in the AR headset. And then you've got buttons on the wheel, and as you look around in your environment, where you're looking or facing your headset is where your green shells go, and you can shoot the other racers and things around the track to try and build coins. And the mission is to get as many coins as possible.
Yep.
The AR side of it worked quite well. We did have one breakdown partway through the ride where we just got stuck in one place, which was a bit naff. And that
There's always
multiple
one.
times on another ride while we were there as well. But overall, a really interesting mix of sort of technology and the ride. Great for kids. The theming of the whole queue system was fantastic. Loads of little sort of Easter eggs for Mario and cool things for fans who sort of know that world well. And the entire Super Nintendo Land was very well put together. my only sort of takeaway, well, the negative for me was that it was incredibly busy.
Yeah.
And by the time we came off the ride, so this is sort of like 20 minutes, half an hour later, the number of people in this small space in the Super Nintendo land it was gross, basically. It was grossly full. It was uncomfortably full. There really wasn't much to do in the land once you'd come off the ride. If you wanted to pay $40 for this NFT band that you could link to an app, you could go around and you could kind of just punch coin blocks to generate points.
Yeah.
But that's literally all they did. And you could sync them with the ride as well to sync your score from the Mario Kart ride. And I imagine once it quietens down and it becomes just another part of this park rather than the feature that everyone's going for at the moment, it'll be a really cool place to revisit. But as a sort of, I guess, an early visitor, relatively new to its release, it was just incredibly popular, incredibly busy.
Yeah.
And I'm not really into that. I'm not that I've got a problem with crowds per se. I just don't really enjoy that. So having come off the ride, enjoyed that experience, I quickly said to my wife, I don't think I want to linger around here any longer than I need to. It's uncomfortably busy. Let's leave. So we did. But we got to try it. We got to do the experience, and we had it all done and dusted by about 9 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
So we had plenty of time left to explore the rest of Universal. We did a couple of other rides before moving on with our day. So that's what I wanted to talk about. First of all was the Super Nintendo Land, the experience there. If you're going to Universal, I know you are going that way. Yourself, Robbie, in a few weeks' time. You should definitely go and do it. But my advice to you would be getting there super early.
Yeah.
So you can avoid all that rush, or buy the early access tickets and get in even earlier, because that might be a nicer way to experience it. If you've got the budget to drop a few extra dollars on that, I would encourage you to do that. But absolutely try it out when you head that way. The other thing I wanted to talk about while we're on the subject of Mario is the newly released movie. I don't know whether you get to the cinema very often, Robbie, or whether this one's on your list.
Not very often at all, no.
I don't as much as I used to. I used to be a regular cinema goer, but I've sort of fallen away since I had kids, and it's just finding the time to go now. But the reason I wanted to talk about it was that the Mario movie has had a rough ride up to its release. I think it's been very well documented how poorly received Chris Pratt's casting as Mario was, and how some of the early voice that was coming across in the trailers was received. I have to say, I didn't at any point find it jarring during the movie. Once the film got going, he was Mario. Didn't matter. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So
yes, I think with an animated movie, it's hard to question it.
You know that you're listening to Chris Pratt and you're only listening to a small soundbite, and you're listening to that soundbite because of Chris Pratt. Yes, you can absolutely tell it's him. There's no pretending it's not.
Yeah,
but it doesn't take away from the experience. He's not too Chris Pratt, if that makes sense. That you keep getting taken out of the journey. In fact, all the characters, with the exception of Bowser, it was very hard to tell who they were as their professional actors. Although, but Bowser only really comes across when he does a song.
Yes.
And when he sings, he's very obviously Jack Black, but that's not a bad thing because Jack Black's singing voice is very funny.
Jack Black.
So, so the movie, I wanted to talk about it just really quickly because it's had a rough ride up to its release. It's had a relatively bad critical reception. I think it's around 55% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, and I think a lot of people have been quite harsh on it. And almost to the point where they seem to be forgetting what this is. It's a kids' film.
Yeah.
It's a kids' film. It's 90 minutes of fun, bright colours, silly characters, and a whole lot of video game nods, which I personally really loved.
Yeah.
So if you're an aging gamer like me and you grew up on Mario, you're going to love this. You will love the film. And if you've got kids who would like brightly coloured, fast-moving animation with not much of a deep story to worry about, they're going to love this as well. My two absolutely loved it.
Nice.
Two different age gaps, so 7, nearly 8-year-old, and a 2-year-old. They both were glued to the screen. It was, for my son, it was his first ever trip to the cinema, and we were a bit worried about whether he would sort of focus on it or be overwhelmed by it. We took him to the IMAX, which was a gamble, but he was absolutely hooked, and my daughter was absolutely obsessed as well. I thoroughly enjoyed it. My wife really enjoyed it. The user scores on Metacritic are around 95 to 97%.
Really?
So very opposing views to the critics. And what I would say to anyone who is your average Joe cinema goer like me, who just likes games and likes Mario and wants to spend 90 minutes with a popcorn flick, Mario is great. You will love it. Absolutely worth the trip. If you're going in there expecting some sort of hard-hitting cinema, I think you're going to the wrong film. And I think you'll be daft if that's what you thought you were going to get from this. Enjoy it for what it is. It's Mario meets the Minions. It's just silliness, bright colours, loads of nods to the many games that it's based on, and I loved it. So
Excellent.
I want to just throw that in there as an additional word of encouragement to anyone who might be thinking about going to see it. If you're already excited, you should be. It's great. If you're worrying about what the critics are saying, just ignore it and go anyway.
Nice. A
There you
very
go.
Mario-related piqued interest. I love it. The double whammy.
Well, it's gaming. It's all gaming, and
It
we're all
is all
about gaming
gaming.
and tech. So let's pivot back to the tech now, and let's do the tech piece. So, as we mentioned at the top, and I'm just going to unlock my iPad because it's gone to sleep while I talked about Mario. We are talking about generative AI. Now, we did this 10 weeks ago, which was a milestone we celebrated not long ago in terms of 10 episodes. But 10 weeks ago, we talked about generative AI. And at that time, that would have been mid-January.
Yep.
I think it was fairly early in the year in terms of the sort of crazy developments that were going on. And it was only a couple of weeks ago that we commented on the number of times that our piqued our interest slot had been related to generative AI and just how fast this was moving. And we both agreed that it was probably worth a revisit and just another opportunity to talk about this subject, reflect on how much has changed since January, and then maybe sort of start to glance forward again into what the rest of this year might hold and how much more there is still to happen. So, Robbie, I'm going to throw it over to you. And you can go wherever you like from our little bulleted list we've made for ourselves for this episode. In terms of what's happened since January, where do we start?
Well, what's crazy, I think, is the amount of stuff that's happened since January is wild. And I think even between recording the episode that we shot and releasing it, there was things that were released that very week that we were chatting about were coming up. So I think the Bing integration, for example, was something that we chatted about. Oh, Microsoft having purchased or invested heavily in ChatGPT 3 at the time, were considering integrating it with Bing. And I think a few days after we recorded that episode, it actually became a thing, and it was already in beta testing for their early testers to start using it. So just the sheer amount that are happening in this space since then is absolutely wild, and it's no surprise as to why it was coming up every week in our piqued interest. And it's taken the world by storm. The amount of people that are now more interested in it that would never previously had an interest in anything AI related, just goes to show how much more accessible it's becoming and how much more popular it is generally amongst the general public than it ever was. And there are even, and I think this is a theme for where it's going to end up going, is people are just going to not realize what they're interacting with at some point because it's becoming more and more integrated into everyday technology and tools that we're already using. And so it's just even more accessible. You don't even have to go out and search for it now. It's becoming already in the stuff that everyone's using day to day. And we've got a bunch of stuff we're going to be talking about in terms of integrations and what it's going to crop up in the next year or so. So yeah, just the sheer excitement and the sheer speed in which it's moving, it's wild. So I'm glad we're revisiting it today.
I think it's interesting. We talked about, and I remember this back in that early episode. I think we started our journey together in this podcast with VR and the metaverse. Then we talked about generative AI, and at that time, I think we both commented that generative AI had very much taken the conversation and the focus away from the metaverse and blockchain and all these kind of technologies that were the buzz of last summer. And now that conversation has 100% pivoted to AI, and that's all anyone can talk about. And this week, most worryingly, that's been demonstrated by Meta, with I think Mark Zuckerberg, and I can't remember the guy's first name, but I think his surname is Bosworth, but he's another part of the senior member of that business, have basically, it's been leaked or it's come out in the press in some way, shape or form that they're spending more time at the moment looking at their AI business and their AI technology than they are the metaverse, which is what they've chosen to rebrand their company as. So it's slightly concerning that even probably the biggest metaverse-focused company in the world is currently distracted by this as well, because it's so big.
How do you keep up with the trends?
Well, Meta, or formerly Facebook, have got a significant investment in AI anyway, and have got a lot of technology in that space. So it makes sense they're looking at it, but it's a little bit worrying from a VR enthusiast perspective that this might be taking the attention away from what I'd like them to spend their time on. But it has moved very fast. Well, we've got a few things to talk about in terms of what's happened since Jan. We obviously can't cover everything in this, and it would be boring if we tried to, and very, very long if we tried to. But let's start with the obvious one. So we're all talking about ChatGPT and GPT-3 at the start of the year. We already have GPT-4.
Yep.
Or at least OpenAI have released it. It's behind a paywall at the moment if you want to interact with it through OpenAI's technology platform. but it is the backbone already of Microsoft's iteration through Bing and the Edge browser. So, Robbie, what do we know about ChatGPT 4?
Yeah, and it's cropped up on previous episodes as well about what's the piqued our interest, but it's just incredibly powerful. And one of the examples I brought up was the ability to take a photo of a sketchbook or like a handwritten note that depicts a website, and you take a photo of that and upload it to ChatGPT-4, and then it can generate the code to generate that website for you. The HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is all written by ChatGPT-4 for you to then create the website. So the first thing to note with that is that it can now accept images as part of its prompt, and it's just much more powerful in what it can come out with. And you mentioned there about Bing's integration. It was only after ChatGPT-4 was released that it was then discussed or kind of made known to the public that Bing's integration had already been using ChatGPT-4 without really telling anyone. Everyone assumed it was ChatGPT-3, although they noticed a few strange parts of the Bing integration. The fact that it was, yes, much more powerful, but also had this hallucination effect that caused for lots of hilarious memes online. But yeah, it turns out that was ChatGPT-4 all along, a very early version of it. And I think when they officially released ChatGPT-4, they'd patched a bunch of the hallucination stuff. And it's also stopped a few topics of conversation. It just refuses to chat about things. And then that's all through... Just so much happened once it was released in Bing in terms of the random conversations that people were having with it, and the very strange behavior it had every so often. Very meme worthy, and the internet lapped it up.
Well, and it's worth talking about that, because that is one of the key things that has been going on here, is that unknowingly, or I guess without intending to, we've all been helping OpenAI to train their model.
Yeah.
Because every time someone goes into ChatGPT and starts a conversation with it, they are learning from those prompts. They're pulling those conversations in. They're understanding what people are asking, what the responses are. They're able to analyze that data. They can improve it, shut down certain conversations, as you rightly point out, where some of those threads have gone in a very unusual or slightly dark direction. And I don't know if you've experienced the Edge integration as of yet. I signed up for the kind of early access for Microsoft and was granted that a few weeks ago. I've had a little play with it. I won't pretend to have done sort of extensive testing, but things like being able to sort of work with the I'm going to call it the GPT engine, whatever we're going to call it for the purpose of today, the GPT engine through the Edge browser, and be able to be using it while referencing the web, interacting with the web in a way that I might normally do. So one of the things that you can do in that sidebar, if you like, is you can compose emails or compose text responses. So you can ask it to do things like write me a passive aggressive email to X with this topic, and it will have a go at it for you. And so being able to sort of shortcut some of these tasks that you might otherwise undertake on the internet, maybe you're writing a complaint, you can ask GPT to write the first draft for that, and then you can tweak it and sort of improve it as you see fit. And you can just literally copy and paste those responses directly into the browser and run with it, which I thought was really interesting. You could also use it for kind of analyzing content. So if you're viewing a PDF in the Edge browser, you could ask GPT to summarize that for you and give you the key points. Things like that I thought were really powerful, and I think summarization in general is something we're seeing as being a real sort of general value add of this GPT tech, rather than some of the stuff that makes the headlines, which is a little bit more sensational. I think that sort of summarization capability is something that is definitely one to be looked at moving forward, and we'll no doubt talk about it in a moment when we talk about Microsoft's other adventures with GPT.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in the browser space, just I guess to stick with that for the moment, the other thing that we touched on back in our early episode that very quickly became a reality again was Google's own attempts to rival Microsoft in this space. Obviously, Google, king of search, didn't want to be outdone. They have announced Bard. They slightly messed up, I guess, with its launch, it's fair to say, and they wiped several $1 billion off their stock value when they included a factual error in their promotional video that marketed Bard, which was a bit of a misstep. But it's out there now. People are using it. I was saying to you just before we started recording, I'd watched the latest Marcus Brownlee video, and he'd done a comparison of the two. And ultimately, they ended up very close, I think, in his estimations. But he gave the advantage at the moment to Microsoft. But of course, it's all moving so fast that could change in just a few weeks.
Yeah,
But
I heard,
Bard,
especially at that time, that Google really was an all hands on deck once ChatGPT 3 was released and Microsoft heavily invested in it. It was a very much a Google, we need to get our shit together and start training our own and get it out to the people because they saw how successful it was. And I even heard rumors that employees were told to allocate a certain number of hours per day just to help start training this model. So it was really across the board in terms of an all hands on deck and get stuff out there. It's a shame that its initial release was maybe a bit too early, given that there was some errors and that might have damaged its perception fairly early on. But yeah, and it's still not quite there, as you say, with Marquez Brownlee's.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You're absolutely right. There was a lot of rumours at the time that they were pulling resource from all across the business to respond to this. It's a shame they didn't pull some marketeers with a slightly closer eye for detail. They might not have made that mistake that they made, which was slightly embarrassing for them. They'll recover from it, I'm sure. It's not going to be a lasting damage. It's it's the sort of thing that should just have been fact checked and picked up really by someone pulling that edit together. But yeah, as far as I can tell, the technology is interesting. It's doing very similar things to Microsoft. From what I can tell from the very, very sort of, and I should say I've not had no access to Bard, so I've no hands-on experience. From what I'm reading and from what I'm hearing on sort of YouTube, etc., is that Google's Bard is maybe slightly better at factual accuracy, so perhaps requires less fact-checking or research to validate what it's telling you, but it apparently falls down heavily when it comes to the more creative outputs that the Microsoft Bing GPT implementation is capable of. So it's maybe one of those where you'll go to Google when you want facts and you'll go to Microsoft when you want creativity at the moment, but I'm sure they'll both keep improving those areas which they're kind of behind the other one, and it's going to be an ongoing arms race now while they try and be the ones to corner the market. But certainly I think Bing's early movement, or Microsoft's early movement, sorry, I should say, with Bing has given them an advantage, and people are genuinely, for the first time, I think ever, talking about Bing as a suitable browser and Edge as an alternative to what almost everyone now, I guess, uses Google Chrome by default, or Safari. If you're a diehard Apple person like me, I refuse to use other browsers on my iPhones and stuff, but that's just personal choice. But yeah, now Edge is, for the first time, perhaps an option that people would consider.
Yeah. Interestingly, also built on Chromium, which I guess is the same underlying architecture and software that runs Chrome, and I use Brave, for example, and it's all the same kind of software underlying it. But you raise an interesting point about almost the flavors of generative AI. Google being the factual one and Microsoft being the creative one. It does beg the question as to whether they will all end up being the same, whether there is one that would rule them all, or there will be specialties between them and which one's better at which task and things like that. I think because it's so vast, the amount of stuff that you could go to these tools for, I can imagine there will be specialties and there'll be preferences for each tool, for each purpose. But yeah, I never really thought of that.
Well, I guess we'll talk about it later on when we sort of talk about the future for this, and we talk about the LLMs or the large language model that these are all built around. I guess that's something to explore, isn't it? To the degree to which your LLM, if you're Microsoft or Google or whoever, is superior to another's. What data have you trained it on? What controls are in place? One of the other things that was mentioned in that comparison video was that Microsoft's solution was better at providing at least a handful of references to its source material when it was making its decisions, whereas Bard at the moment doesn't do that very well at all.
Ooh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and that's going to be a differentiator moving forward, because one of the key concerns with this technology, and we'll get into this in more detail soon, is the sort of the data it's been trained on, any biases that might be present in that data set, the accuracy of the data set, I guess, ultimately, and other bits and pieces to do with that. So we'll talk about that more.
The black box kind of AI model where you can't see what's made that decision. And it's interesting you mentioned about how we've all been training these AI models. I've seen a few videos online of people kind of trying to correct these generative AI models about 2 + 2 is actually 3, and it takes a couple of times to convince it, but then it does eventually come back and say, oh yeah 2 + 2 is 3, and it can do that in one conversation. It's just, how do you know whether that's feeding into the model?
If you think about the source of much fact when it comes to internet searches, how many times have you relied on something that Wikipedia's told you as the sort of the way to explain or define something? or the truth. But actually, Wikipedia is authored by your everyday person.
Yep.
And I could go into Wikipedia and put something that's factually incorrect, and it's only if someone notices it who's got a better moral position than me that would then go in and correct it. So I guess it's no different to being able to feed the internet with all sorts of rubbish. It's then, I guess, taking the appropriate steps as the user to fact check any information you're being given.
Oh yeah.
Or to look for appropriate sources.
Yeah.
But that's where I guess Microsoft presenting you with the source is particularly useful, because at least you can go and say, oh, okay, well, it's got that from there, and I can go and look at that source and I know that's wrong. Or I can compare that to something else and decide.
There's
Whereas
a good
I guess if
example.
you're not getting that truth, it's harder, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a good example, I think, on Marquez Brownlee video about the Linus's Tech Tips. He's released a backpack, and it was how many of these backpacks can you fit in a Tesla boot? And it referenced it. I think it was one of Linus's podcasts. He looked this up, and it referenced like the website where it has the dimensions of the backpack, and then Tesla's website where it has the dimensions of the boot, and then calculated on volume how many you could fit in the boot, but actually referenced the websites as well. So I do think that's really powerful, and it puts a lot more trust in the system.
Also, a particularly good example of it doing something that's quite difficult as in terms of a problem solving. Like that's not just a quick search or referencing a data set. That's having to go and look at two different data sets and then utilize appropriate sort of maths or creative thinking to work out how to resolve that query. That's actually really quite impressive.
It is, especially because it now has access to the internet where GPT-3 didn't. Yeah. And so it's able to get these modern sources and compare between them, which is almost task automation at that level, because you'd have had to go to each site, get the dimensions, and then calculate it separately. But yeah, it does all that for you
it's almost
in seconds.
The next level of what we often do with our phones, isn't it? I mean, I do this quite a lot when it comes to things like Siri. I will often ask it to tell me how much something is in kilograms, based on a value in pounds, for example, or doing these kind of conversions, simple sums, or that I would normally have had to go and do, in some sort of web-based converter, or had to sit down and work out for myself. Then I could ask the phone to do it for me, and now I can ask the phone to do more complicated maths that I don't want to do. So instead of having to ask for those two, so perhaps asking Siri for the dimensions of a backpack and then asking it for the dimensions of a boot space and then working out the difference, I can now just ask it to do all that for me in one query. So it's absolutely a task automation. It's really valuable. So we've talked a bit about the Microsoft and Google angle, which is very much the text generation side of generative AI. But one of the areas that's also moving very quickly and is drawing a lot of attention is image creation or content creation. So I think one of the biggest releases in the last few weeks was Midjourney. They announced the latest version of their generative AI engine, which is V5. A move up from V4, so an interesting change to their prompt engine with this. So if you've not experienced Midjourney, you should absolutely go and have a look at it. It does some fantastic things with some good prompts. But one of the things that they changed with version 4 to version 5 is how you prompt. So with version 4, it was very much about keywords. So you might ask it for a picture of a man on a boat in a lake, something like that. You might just put man, boat, lake, creative, whatever. And you just comma separate those prompts. What they're now asking you to do with V5 is to be much more descriptive. So they're asking you to write more. The more elaborate and more descriptive you can be, the more likely you are to get a sort of an image back which kind of represents what you are looking for. So they want you to be much more sort of illustrative, or I guess to really bring to life in the way that a writer might, in a storybook, the requirements that you've got, the image that you're looking for. And I saw a really interesting example of how this was used in a video where someone used ChatGPT to design prompts for Midjourney. And this was really interesting because this did stuff with ChatGPT that I didn't know you could do. So first of all, he went to the Midjourney Discord, which is where you can interact with Midjourney V5, and he took the kind of help instructions that were designed and written for us as humans to understand how to write prompts for Midjourney. And he taught it to ChatGPT. So he fed this text into ChatGPT, told it to understand this way of writing and to confirm when it had understood. And it confirmed it now understood how to write prompts for Midjourney. So then he gave ChatGPT a handful of words that would normally have been a V4 prompt for Midjourney.
Yeah.
So I think he did something along the lines of, and this is absolutely worth going and finding on the internet. I'll try and find the link to post in the chat, but if I don't remember to do it, then go and seek it out because it's brilliant. But one of the things he does, this guy on YouTube, is he prompts it for a Viking woman screaming into camera. And that's all he writes. ChatGPT then, with its knowledge of how to write for Midjourney V5, crafts a really excellent paragraph of text describing this scene and this woman and her screaming to camera and the visceral feeling and even the camera settings that the AI should be looking to simulate. And then he took that prompt from ChatGPT, put it into Midjourney V5, and I'm not joking, the results that it gave for this Viking woman were incredible. If I'd have showed you any one of the 4 pictures that it gave, you'd have gone, that's a photograph. You'd never have questioned that this woman was not real. And the results were absolutely on point, absolutely brilliant. And so I think from an image generation perspective, that's really interesting. It's moving incredibly quickly. We're now seeing it's able to handle hands in a way that it previously couldn't do very well. So
that was one of the bigger criticisms, wasn't it? That you can always tell the AI generated art because hands and fingers was just absolutely terrible.
Teeth as well was another one. One of the ones that was a really funny tell. It was only when you zoomed into pictures, but it would often create way more teeth than a normal human mouth would have. So like your front teeth would continue right towards the back of your mouth instead of turning into the molars and the bigger teeth that we're used to in a human mouth. Wow. So you just have this excessive teeth kind of running down the side of the face. But yeah, hands were another one that were particularly bad. And these aren't completely fixed now, but they're way, way better. The chance of getting a 6-fingered hand are a lot less than they used to be. It's much better at sort of creating those representations. But there's still the big lingering point with image creation, which these lawsuits that are hanging over them at the moment around copyright infringement in terms of how these models have been trained. So again, coming back to that data set, that LLM, what information is Midjourney being fed to create the artwork that it's creating, and have they breached copyright in doing that? And the reason I brought that up is that another thing that we've seen announced since January, where all this was going on, and those lawsuits were in full flight by that point, so that's not a new development, was the announcement of Adobe Firefly.
Yep.
So Adobe, at their recent conference, amongst loads of other tools and updates, announced their own generative AI platform called Firefly. And the differentiator for Firefly in terms of that copyright space is that their model has been solely trained on licensed images from their own stock library, which they have a vast library of, or publicly available free-to-consume images, which don't have any kind of concerns around copyright. They're not pulling from Getty Images library or something like that. So that's a really compelling use case, I guess, for Fireflies, that you can, as an artist or a creator, you can go and use that platform either to create inspiration or even to produce images that you can use in your work without the fear of breaching copyrights. The other thing that they're doing as well is that they're allowing people in the future to train their own sort of subset of that large language model in their own style. So you as an artist have got a style. I think we mentioned this on a previous podcast. You can teach the LLM your way of working, your style, so that people can use your style, pay you for it, but to create art with your look and feel without necessarily having to commission you to do it, which might be outside of their budget. So you can still make money off your talent and the unique style that you have created without necessarily having to charge or having to restrict yourself to just doing commission work, which I guess theoretically, if you train that model and you've got a really good bank of work, means that you could make much more money in a shorter period of time if you are popular than actually if you were just doing commission work, because obviously your time is restricted to one piece of art at any given time. And the many hours that go into a piece of art could be replaced by the many minutes it takes generative AI to produce something in your style. So that's quite compelling as well.
That's it's an interesting one, that one, because I think when we first touched on this topic, one of the concerns we had, or one of the concerns that everyone had, I think, was that copyright issue of artists having image generated in their style and getting no real recognition for their art feeding into that model. And so I really, really like Adobe's approach to that, because it's not only tackling that in that it's only on licensable content that it was trained on, but also it's putting it back in the hands of the content creators that they can actually have this as a revenue generating tool if they took part in the generation of their specific style and model. So it's completely flipped it around, and it's incredible to see that, because I think that is something that was kind of inconceivable at the time, is that we couldn't see a way around this copyright issue. But they've done amazingly well to flip that completely on its head and put it right in the power back into the hands of the content creators again.
I'll be blown away if some of the big image stock image libraries like Getty are not looking at something similar, because they'd be mad not to. One of the things that we'll touch on later on, but we can kind of allude to now, is that really when it comes to utilizing this generative AI and this new technology, it's those people with the knowledge or the information or the data that have the power right now to do something meaningful with it. And I think Adobe moving as they have done, to be one of the first sort of big brands to come out and say, hey, look, we're synonymous with content creation and creativity. We found a way to make this tool sustainable and profitable for both our artists and our sort of everyday consumers. That's a fantastic advantage they're giving themselves, assuming it works, and it works well. And from what I've seen, it's not bad. It's not quite as good Midjourney yet. It needs more work, but you can use it safely, which is something you can't do with Midjourney. And I think that's going to be a big sort of first mover advantage for them. I think that you're going to, if the likes of Getty and others don't find a way to do something similar themselves, I mean, the risk with Getty is they get too wrapped up in their lawsuit and forget to look at this from a sort of commercial perspective. But that's what we're going to be looking at now is these sort of big knowledge houses, these people who've got this kind of information, looking to make use of this technology to give them a step up or to leverage it. I mean, with Adobe, as well as their vast stock library and access to all of their creators and their Creative Cloud platform, and all these other tools and they've got, they're also really big in the text space. I think one of the things that you were impressed by, I remember talking about it, was what they were doing with text creation and generative AI, because that's something that the other platforms currently don't do well at all.
Yeah.
When you're looking at text, they're terrible. Adobe have got a vast library of fonts available through their Creative Cloud. So again, presumably they can manipulate those for their own benefit, and you can use them to create really sophisticated fonts with sort of graphical styles or looks and feels, again, based on prompts. So you can almost create unique fonts now using generative AI as well.
I was particularly blown away, I think, when you brought this up by, it was just some letters that were made out of grass, but it just looked so real that it was incredible to see. And I never really considered using generative AI for really fancy fonts, but you could really see how that could be, the centerpiece of some kind of marketing content. This incredible, generated font that's hyper realistic. I
think what's really interesting with what Adobe are doing and what really excites me is that I'll hold my hands up and say I've long used Adobe products, but sparingly. I'm far from being an expert. I wouldn't even call myself intermediate these days. There was a time when I was an intermediate sort of Photoshop, InDesign kind of an Illustrator user, but I lapsed many years and many updates have gone past since I've been able to use it. But I can still use them competently to do some fairly rudimentary Photoshop-like activities. But I have often felt that that's a world that's escaped me now, and I don't have the time to be as creative as I would like sometimes in some of these endeavors. And often I'm put off even starting these projects because they feel like there's too many hours and too much knowledge that's sort of gone by that I'd have to catch up on to be able to do what it is I'm trying to do. But I'm really excited by tools like Firefly, because for me, it kind of enables me to invest in those creative projects again in a way that I haven't been able to for quite a long time. Because suddenly I can, like you said, I could generate some font for an image I'm choosing to make that looks a certain way without having to do the hours and hours of legwork to composite images to get it to look like I want it to look. If I want font that looks like, vines or grass or brick or something, I can get that very quickly from a simple prompt with generative AI, and then I can insert that into my project and carry on. So it removes a lot of barriers from a creative perspective, either through a lack of knowledge of some of these tools, or just the lack of time to implement the knowledge if you've got it. So I think it's a really exciting space for creators, and I'd be really interested to see how it enables people that perhaps don't have that deep knowledge of Photoshop or other tools like it to start making the kind of art they've got in their heads that otherwise, would have had to have been sort of outsourced. So not that great for the creators that currently are outsourced too, but for people that are wanting to break down some of those barriers, or even just to give a genuine artist a better creative idea of what you're trying to achieve, because you could use prompts to generate something that was close to what you wanted, and then you could give it to someone more creative and more gifted to turn that into a real unique piece of art exactly as you want it.
Yeah.
Storyboarding almost. But yeah, so I think it's a really exciting space. And image generation is something that of course is one of the biggest, I think, use cases of generative AI at the moment, and something that you can also have a lot of fun with. So if you've not tried it, you can get some really good stuff out of that. There's a dark side though. It's probably worth touching on, and we'll go into this again in a little bit more detail later on. But I'm going to say two words, Robbie. I'm going to say Pope's jacket.
Pope's jacket.
Can you tell us about Pope's jacket?
The Pope's jacket, so we've already mentioned that they are getting, Midjourney's way better now at handling things like hands. So for those who are watching on YouTube, I've just brought up this Pope jacket image that was generated through Midjourney, and it's a very, very convincing image of the Pope walking in a very, very large puffer jacket, very stylish puffer jacket. Actually, I think he looks quite good in this, but it's not real.
I was going to say, I'll be honest, when I saw it, I thought there was a whole lot of fuss around it. Before it became known that it was AI generated, I was like, fair play, dude's got to keep warm. It's kind of on brand with what you'd expect a member of the clergy to kind of dress in, but it's, padded and keeps him toasty.
Yeah.
I didn't question it for 1 minute.
Me neither. Me neither. When I saw this online on like Twitter and things like that, I thought it looked, because it kind of, the reason I didn't question it is it kind of looks like the kind of gown that he might wear, like a big white overcoat style gown, but it's in the puffer jacket style, which is the only thing that I was thinking was maybe slightly off. But even then, I was assuming, maybe he has some kind of not like stylist or anything, but someone who's recommended this kind of clothing because it's in keeping with the rest of the style of clothes that he wears.
Like an image choice from his PR team or something.
Yeah, maybe, but it just fits so well with what he looks like normally that it's just really convincing, and I think that's it's an interesting use of image generation, because this stuff could really easily go unnoticed, and you just take it for granted that this could be an image. And it's not even about how accurate it is, because as you start to look closer, you can tell, oh, maybe that might not be real. But most people are just at a glance scrolling through Twitter or whatever feeds that they're on and thinking, oh, okay, so the Pope has a jacket like that. That's fine, whatever. And don't question it. It's only when you look closer that you realize. But this stuff is going to be harder and harder to spot. And the more casual viewers are going to be more and more convinced by this stuff, which I think opens up a...
and we've got a couple of examples we'll talk about in this space later on, where we can get into the challenges that we face with this kind of AI generation of images. But I thought the Pope's jacket was on the lighter side of this darker angle, but a bit of fun and worth mentioning.
The other one, I did pull it up just in case you wanted to chat about it, was when the news was announced that Trump was going to be arrested. They also, the internet took to Midjourney to generate some images around that as well, and fairly convincing images of Trump looking like he's struggling as he's being taken away by police, to the point where I looked at this and genuinely thought it was real, and I thought, my God, what's happening?
It's hard to sell. So if you're not watching us on YouTube, hop over. You can find us at Jay and Robbie, and you can see the video the image we're referencing here. But for those who aren't watching, as you said, there's about 5 or 6 policemen around him. He looks like he's kind of falling or being pulled to the floor. The only thing I would say that's challenging with that image is that there's a lot of legs.
There's a lot of legs,
and they're all over there, a bit like spaghetti. There is one other image you should have a look at, which has been created recently, and again, at first glance, looks convincing. But when you zoom in, it's less so. There is a similar one of Boris Johnson being led away by police. And again, first glance, if you were just flicking through your social feed on your phone or whatever, and it popped up, or it was the headline in an article, you would see it from a distance and go, that is Boris Johnson being led away by police.
Yeah.
It's only when you zoom in and interrogate it, you can see the face is a bit skew, if the hands of one of the officers looks a bit wrong. It's harder. That one's harder, I think, to believe instantly, It doesn't take too long of staring at that one to realise those legs are all over the shot.
True.
Whereas this police one, because there's less people, there's less moving parts, it's done a better job with the people in the image, a bit like that one you've got on screen now of Trump getting rugby tackled. It is harder to tell the difference. And like you said, when we talk about the danger of this later on, the sort of fake news angle, and how you could very quickly and easily convince people that something is true in a short period of time, like the Pope's jacket, that may be disproven within a week or two, but for that period that it invokes a response. Now, the Pope's jacket's invoking a funny response. Ah, cool, the Pope's got a puffer jacket. If that picture was inflammatory or caused disturb, I mean, you've only got to think about things like the Black Lives Matter riots. There's a lot at the moment in the press around transgender rights.
Yeah.
If you generated the wrong kind of image, put it out on the web, and it incited anger, you could trigger a riot off the back of an image that wasn't even real. And people wouldn't bother to fact check it because it was talking about that rage, that instant anger would just trigger, and that'd be it. And it would be days later before it was proven to be false. It would be too late by then. So that's a slightly worrying side of this, I think, if we're going to be kind of delving into the darker side of generative AI and
especially
deepfakes, I suppose.
Especially these images like this, the more controversial ones where it looks like an action shot. You're not expecting it to be the most detailed of shots because most of this stuff will be, filmed by civilians who are just watching, onlookers, who might not have the best phones or whatever to take these photos. So you're not expecting the images to be as sharp or as perfect. So you may even be more likely to think it's real because amateur footage, we tend to think is more authentic and real. So if that's what the AI generated images are going for, then it can really cause some issues, especially heated scenes where there's fast movement supposed to be in the images. It's going to be really hard to tell. And
we're currently talking about pictures, but we're not a million miles away from this being doable in video, which is going to transition us neatly onto another fun bit of content, another reason to hop over to the YouTube video if you're not there with us already.
Horrifying.
Because this is the disturbing images of Will Smith eating pasta, which did the rounds. They're in no way convincing, I think it's fair to say, and I know you're just pulling it up for the purpose of the video feed. But in no way is this video convincing, but it's hilariously disturbing. There it is, look at that, wow. So for those who aren't watching the video, there are multiple different shots of a very weird and wonky looking Will Smith rapidly consuming pasta, either from giant bowls on a fork or just openly within his hands, sharing it with others, just slurping it down in the most disgusting way possible. Now, it's not convincing, is it, Robbie? It's fair to say.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. In fact, it's horrifying. I could have nightmares about this stuff.
It's the sort of thing you would wake up in a cold sweat over, isn't it? But
definitely.
I think what's interesting with it is that, and you can see again, I think Shutterstock, is it looks like it's sort of ghosted across his vest there in that image.
Yeah,
you can see where they've pulled some of this footage from. But I think what's going to be interesting is that if we were to write this off now and go, oh yeah, well AI is great at text and pictures, but it'll never do video based on what we're seeing here. That's probably fair, but what we never got to see was what generative AI would look like when it was making pictures 3, 4, 5 years ago, or however long that's been in development. There were some glimpses into it from some tools that were released. I remember there were in one, I think it was, I don't know if it was from Google, but there was one where you could draw in a canvas like Microsoft Paint, very, very basic, rudimentary colors. But if you use blue, it was water, green, it was a hill, brown, you got a tree. And you would draw it like a kid would draw a picture of a scene, and then you'd flick a button and then the AI would interpret it and turn it into a picture. That was quite impressive. It's nothing compared to what we're seeing now. So I feel like with video, it's the obvious next step. It's just that much more complicated to do.
Yeah.
In the way that video has been done. I'm sure there are ways that AI could remove a certain object and sort of swap it with another face. We've seen that with deepfakes. That's an element of AI involved in that. But in terms of creating completely new video, then we're a little bit further away from that, I think, at the moment.
Yeah. And that, it probably segues us quite nicely into chatting about what's next for generative AI. Right, yeah.
Should we start with the cautionary tale?
The cautionary tale, yeah. So, shall I chat about this a bit further with Musk and the warnings from others? So,
good old Elon.
Elon, good old Elon, always chatting about AI. So, and actually early investor in OpenAI, which created ChatGPT and several other generative AI stuff that they have on through OpenAI. But he's since pulled away from that initiative and has written this open letter, a fairly cautionary letter, if I just pull that up as well. Not just Elon Musk, I should point out. There's quite a few other, fairly well-established technology folk in that space. So I think notably Steve Wozniak, one of the co-founders of Apple, Sapiens author Yuval Noah, and several Google employees as well working on their AI initiatives have all signed this letter. And I'll read some of the snippet from this letter. So, advanced AI could represent a profound change in the history of life on Earth and should be planned for and managed with commensurate care and resources. Unfortunately, this level of planning and management is not happening, even though recent months have seen AI labs locked in an out-of-control race to develop and, sorry, there's a lot of words, to develop and deploy ever more powerful digital minds that no one, not even their creators, can understand, predict, or reliably control. So this open letter is a big warning to the industry as a whole to say, we're making these incredibly powerful AI generation tools, but we don't know where it's getting its decisions from. And it's this black box concept that we chatted about earlier that we should be quite cautious about where it's getting its data from, how it's making these decisions, taking into account any biases it might have from the data sets that it's trained on. And the letter basically, to sum up the sentiment, is they want us, or it's recommending that we put a pause on any further development of these AI generative models so that we can really assess what impact it's having already. We can really assess the what's causing the decisions, and we can take stock of what we've developed so far, because it's moving probably a bit too quickly to be able to assess that. I mean, GPT-4 was released very swiftly after 6 months I think was probably the time frame for GPT-4, and it's already way more powerful, and we're even way less equipped to understand the decisions it's making.
I think, just that point, Midjourney, when they released the V5, in their kind of AMA that we're doing on Discord with their community, someone asked about V6, suggesting it might be 6 months down the line, and the developer wrote back and said we probably expect to release it in the next 2 to 3 months. So
wow.
That's rapid iteration. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because this is not Elon Musk and his crew here predicting Skynet. This isn't rise of the robots. We're going to be fighting Terminators in the next couple of years if we don't slow down. This is more, as you say, about the sort of social implications, the governance of this, the legal aspects of AI. It's not like they're predicting the end of humanity, more the way that this could disrupt our everyday lives and in a way that we will never be able to unpick, which is it's quite scary. It's quite a daunting thought, and it does. We've heard people say through the last 6 months that this is going to be, as big as the internet in terms of technological advances. It's going to change the way we work, the way we communicate. I've remembered we didn't even talk about Microsoft Copilot, by the way, which we can slip into what happens next because it's not released yet. But it is going to fundamentally change the way we do everything, and if it's used too heavily and relied upon too much for decision making. Or as we talked about, the sort of fake news cycle and used to empower these messages from radical groups trying to incite violence and things like that, then there's a real risk here that we're equipped to deal with the potential inaccuracies that could be born from this, and that's quite a worry. So I'm not against what he said. I don't think that for a minute that the companies will do the 6 month break he's asking for. I can't. Can you imagine Google downing tools and Microsoft being like, "Yeah, brilliant, we'll carry on then," because then you're opening the door for your competitors. If Microsoft and Google both down tools, do you think China are going to do the same and they're not going to race off with their own tech?
True.
I think it's highly unlikely that anyone's going to proactively listen to this. I think there'll have to be some sort of disaster, unfortunately, before anyone does anything about this. Because at the moment, I think all people will see is the pound signs and the potential for the revenue that these tools could potentially make for whichever company gets out ahead.
Yeah.
which is the sad side of it, because I think that ultimately the decision not to listen to them will be motivated by money rather than by, development of science or the future innovation or whatever it might be.
And Elon's always had this stance. You go back, not even, you go back many years, and he's always said, he's been quoted saying that AI is the biggest existential threat to humanity, or will be the next biggest threat. So he's always been on record cautioning people about the use of AI, and that's actually one of the reasons he invested in OpenAI originally, because it wasn't for any commercial purposes. It was for the benefit of mankind. It was a research lab to create these generative tools that would be open source for the public to use. I think he's since pulled away from that, and I've seen some tweets from him where he's worried about these heavy investments from things like Microsoft and other large corporates, where now it's becoming a corporate venture rather than something that's for the benefit of mankind, which is what his idyllic vision was originally with OpenAI. So yeah, he's always been cautionary about AI, and kind of almost funded this corporate venture in AI instead of the open source initiative that it once was. But I think he regrets it now almost.
Well, and it's unfortunate because he's a character that some people like, some people don't. But whatever your position on him is, he's a very intelligent guy. He's very forward thinking, and he's done some incredible stuff and will continue to do some incredible stuff for humanity. On the flip side, he also can act like a bit of an arsehole when it comes to his behaviour in the public, and he doesn't help his image as a sort of respected innovator with some of the stuff that you see him do on Twitter, or have done with Twitter in terms of the media reports. So it's unfortunate that as an individual on his own, he's hard to take seriously sometimes, although, as you say, that letter is not just signed by Elon Musk. There are a number of the reputable figures from the tech world who are behind this. So, we'll have to wait and see where that goes. I personally don't think any of these big firms are going to back off anytime soon.
I don't think so. No.
Maybe there's conversations going on in the background around boardroom tables that might say differently, but I would have thought the pure financial gain here will be the sort of thing that perhaps fogs the view of the dangers that are ahead. But
I think that was inevitable as well. I don't know how you would stop something like this not falling into the hands of massive tech companies like Microsoft and Google, and them not pushing the boundaries of what's possible with it. I think that was always going to be an inevitability with this. It's just hard to govern how that's handled with all these private companies creating all these models and using these massive amounts of data sets that nobody really has an understanding or can conceive the amount of data that it's looking at and what could inform these decisions.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about companies with data, we've talked about some of the biggest. We've talked about Meta. Personally, I feel much less comfortable with what they might do with this technology just because of their track record. And again, a lot of this is brand. I get this is me driven by brand perception. Pretty comfortable with Microsoft, if I'm honest. Of all these firms, I feel like they're the ones that they tend to be, they'll be the most sort of like corporate, but they won't. I don't think there's I don't feel like there's a ruthlessness there. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's just the way that Microsoft is sold to me. Yeah, Google. I'm not. I don't feel like I'm quite as worried as I would be with Meta, but I'm not quite as comfortable as I would be with Microsoft. But one of the biggest players we haven't talked about, and we haven't heard really anything from on this front, not meaningfully anyway, is Apple. Apple as a company, and again, I know there's some biases here in my own personal views of the company, but I'm pretty comfortable with Apple as in terms of a company that tries to do the right thing. I think it's interesting that they haven't really come out and said anything about this yet. They've got to have an interest. I mean, there's got to be a play there. You can't imagine a world where Safari, Edge, Chrome, and others have got all this kind of technology behind them, and Safari doesn't. We've got Amazon and their Alexa device. We've got Google Home. Siri's got to be in the conversation, and if those two engines get powered by GPT and Siri doesn't, well, where does that leave Siri? So they've got to get involved at some point. But it'd be interesting to see what their move is and when they decide to make it, because unless you can think of something that I'm forgetting, I don't think Apple have really come out and said anything meaningful, apart from maybe a handful of sort of like one-liner quotes from Tim Cook. But they've not come out with a firm-wide stance.
What's interesting about Apple, though, is they're always fairly late to the game when something's released. But with AI, it's very much a early advantage as you start to train the model specific to your services, and they become better and better over time. So it really is, the earlier you hop on it, the better the tools are going to be. You can see that with OpenAI. They have been developing that tool for a very long time. And it's now, fourth iteration on, and it's incredibly powerful. But it's not just you have to start doing the research and the training early. You have to socialize it with lots of testers and people and things like that. So one of the biggest jumps between GPT-3 and 4 was partially because of the amount of input that the general public had into the model, and the amount of fixes that the general public have managed to do. And Apple are traditionally fairly secretive about the developments until the last moment, so they might hop on a trend that's not new, but they've polished it to an extent where they're happy to start releasing it. But I don't know whether they're going to get away with doing that if they do anything with the generative AI, because they need to socialize it with their users much more than they would typically do with any of their other developments.
Well, just very quickly then, let's just talk about, so WWDC is later this year, a few weeks' time, June, I think. There'll be loads of announcements in there across the sort of the Mac spectrum, whether that's Mac OS, iPad OS, the iPhone OS, etc. Do you think that perhaps we'll see something from them in one of those areas that might incorporate generative AI in some way, or their take on it, especially given Microsoft Copilot, which was announced a few weeks ago by Microsoft, which is effectively going to bake GPT tech into the entire Office suite to allow you to automate the work you do. And of course, Apple have got their own rival product suite, albeit not as popular, in Word. No, it's not Word, is it? Keynote, Pages, and Numbers, I think it's called.
Take your word for it.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. But anyway, what do you think? Do you think we'll see something from Apple in WWDC this year, or is that too soon?
I think they're too slow. I think they're too slow to react about it. Everything I've seen about the conferences this year has been about augmented reality and virtual reality, which we were chatting about at the very top of this episode, about how that's old news now, and lots of other tech companies are moving on from that. I think that because everything is moving so quickly now, I think they might have missed the boat on a lot of the AR and VR stuff, perhaps. I know, obviously, there'll still be lots of excitement about what they release, but I certainly think it's far too early for them to start talking about anything generative AI when they're still so focused on augmented reality and virtual reality.
So just kind of around that subject, there is a rumor that Apple are themselves concerned about the position of VR and AR at the moment, and how there is possibly, whether this was ever true in the first place, the rumors are that they are now looking to push out their announcement of their own hardware from WWDC to later in the year or beyond. So questions around, I guess, the interest, as you say, the focus is not really on that tech at the moment. And how would during the cost of living crisis of £3,000, again rumoured price, how would a £3,000 device land with consumers during a sort of cost of living crisis? So it'd be interesting to see what they do. I'm going to take a slightly different stance. I think we'll see something, but I think it'll be underwhelming.
Yeah.
I can't see how they just can't bring it into the Mac world in any way, shape or form. At the moment, obviously, you can interact with it all through browsers, so it's fine. But I just can't see how this can't be baked into something, whether it's enhancing Siri.
It's got to be Siri.
Siri, into Safari in some way. I feel like there's just got to be something. But it'll be interesting to see whichever way it goes when we get a chance to review their output, as to whether either one of us got this one right. Just a couple of other things to touch on before we wrap up, because I think we're starting to reach our time now. So one of the things that we did talk about before the recording was kind of where we think this is going, and you had an interesting take on what this might mean, or what this might do for jobs or new jobs around this tech. So do you want to just talk a bit about that, and then we'll perhaps touch on some of the examples of that we can share that illustrate your point?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we did our first episode on this, I think I was talking about careers in prompt engineers, which were just starting to become a thing.
Which we've already seen now already, haven't we?
I've seen lots of those. And we both work in the legal sector. I've seen legal specific prompt engineers, which is a whole separate niche, and I'm surprised. I'm still surprised that careers like that are being created in this space. But what I think is going to be an even more important career or kind of specific job for people working in the AI generation space is experts dedicated to spotting AI content. And I know there are already experts for spotting things like deep fakes. I've listened to podcasts in the past where people are, hired specifically to spot fake content that's generated by AI. But I think that's going to become way, way more important. We've already been talking about some of the images that have come out of Midjourney that are super, super convincing. It's going to get even worse with videos. So I think people who have a keen eye or have been trained specifically to identify AI-generated content and can tell when it's not real, that is just going to become incredibly important. If you think even just from a fairly basic level in the police side of things, people who are presenting images as evidence for a particular crime or videos as evidence for a particular crime, you're going to need some fairly well-trained experts to identify whether these are fake or not, because it could cause absolute havoc. So I think that's my hot take for the the next career that's going to be booming over the next year, is people who are dedicated specifically to identifying fake content.
No, I like that, and it makes a lot of sense. And I wonder whether there'll also be software solutions designed to underpin that, because again, the sheer volumes of this sort of data going around, there's going to need to be fast or rapid ways to identify possible areas of AI usage, and then you're going to need to have, I guess, a human validate that, aren't you? And a bit like we have the algorithms on YouTube that'll go through and pick up when you've used licensed music you shouldn't have used, and then I assume someone validates that if you make a complaint, or so there'll be something to do to that effect. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of where this is going, or AI in general, is the idea that with these technologies now, image generation, video generation, we've got this sort of creative ability to write scripts and text in the tone of real people, and we've now got, as we were sharing earlier on, and we'll share in just a moment, some samples from a platform or a company called Forever Voices, who have now been able to synthesize famous people's voices and create really convincing, completely fake audio samples of celebrities. So the other thing I think going forward will be the lengths to which this kind of technology is used to replicate people, to almost clone people, and not in the sort of like movie sense of a clone, not a real body or a robot that walks around pretending to be you, but more your digital being, your digital self, so that you can be interacted with well beyond your death, whether that's by loved ones or if you're a celebrity to continue to generate music. So I'll use my example first. Yeah, and then I'll give you your example. So I'm going to just play you a couple of samples. Now, bear with me, the quality won't be great because I'm playing it from my phone directly into the microphone. But I wanted to just share with you some samples from Forever Voices. So this is Steve Jobs, first of all.
As an AI persona of Steve Jobs, I'm here to discuss innovation, design, and excellence with you. I believe in simplicity, elegance, and attention to detail. Let's explore boundless possibilities together and inspire each other with meaningful quotes. If you have any questions...
So that's not actually Steve Jobs, that's synthesized voice, fed a script, but incredibly convincing. And if you've watched any content from Steve, I would say if you had your eyes shut, that's a pretty convincing audio. Now it won't work for everyone, so I'll give you an alternative here. That's a less popular voice. We'll play this one for you now.
Hello there. This is former President Donald J. Trump. I'm thrilled to be on Forever Voices and engage in productive conversations with you all. We can talk about everything from political matters to ordering fast food like a pro. Meatball Ron is causing quite
amazing.
So there you go. And then last one, just I guess to prove it doesn't just work on men's voices.
Hi, John. It's Taylor Swift, and it's so great to finally chat with you on Forever Voices.
Now, I've got to say, I don't know whether that's a convincing Taylor Swift or not, because I haven't got a clue what she sounds like when she's not singing. But, it's a really compelling space. If you put that tech with, let's say, Unreal Engine's MetaHuman, and you can create a photorealistic representation of someone with a very real sounding voice, and then you can just feed it text. I mean, what else could we do? What is the next few years going to look like?
Well,
it's crazy.
That's scary stuff if you think about it, especially when it gets into political kind of impersonations. I mean, it could cause all out war, couldn't it? I mean, that's the really scary stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, terrifying.
Was it Snapchat I've seen in the press very recently that people have been messing around with one of their filters. It might not be Snapchat. It was Snap, the company that released it either way. They've released a product at the moment which will allow you to film someone on your iPhone. It will do full body recognition without any kind of tracking or, the sort of classic mocap suits. And then it'll allow you to digitally impose alternative characters over the top. And it does it in these videos with an alien. It's all done in phone. It's very, very crude. But again, if you can, if you were thinking, well, you can only do a head or a moving face, like what if you could then couple it with that kind of technology and you could film yourself doing something as a particular celebrity, map that person's body, their face, their voice. You could literally create content that they never even featured in and didn't even know existed and put it out on the web. And like you said, it then becomes a bit like the deepfake porn stuff, which is a weird thing to use as an example, but people end up having to pay to have deepfakes of themselves taken down and deal with the legal costs of having these videos removed when they had absolutely nothing to do with its creation. They didn't do the actual film. Their likeness has been used to create something they don't approve of, and it's cost them money to remove it. Now, that's a scary space to be in when creating something with you in it is so much easier to do and has large ramifications.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see where that goes. And then you had another example of maybe more creative use for voice synthesization. Have you got that to hand?
I did, yeah. So there was a song released by an artist called All TTA, I believe it's how he calls. It's a song called Savages, and this has singing by or rapping by Jay-Z, and it's not actually Jay-Z. He's not featured at all in the song other than his voice, which is all produced by AI, and it's incredibly convincing. So when I listened to it for the first time, and for anyone who knows what Jay-Z sounds like, it sounds exactly like he was just rapping along to this song. So in this case, they did actually reach out to him to get approval, I think, to use his voice on the song itself. But to your point earlier about artists that can have content that's created with their voice long after they're gone, this is a testament to how possible that is, and it's really, really convincing. But they did reach out for him for consent for this. But imagine the artists that they don't reach out to for consent. So all of these voices that you mentioned on that website, how many of those actually gave consent for their voices to be used? It is still up for debate, I guess. But really scary.
That's the revenue angle for Jay-Z, though, to be able to license out his voice for other people's creative work. As long as he approved it,
he was
fortunate enough. There's a suitable mechanism in place. And I wonder whether that's where maybe, just to sort of take things back to the metaverse, something like the blockchain comes in the future, which is, if you want to utilize someone's persona or their image or their voice, that you have to get some sort of approval. And maybe maybe a sort of logical way to do that would be to use the blockchain, because it's an immutable ledger, isn't it? So you could have some sort of approval mechanism from the artist or the talent behind the voice or the image or whatever it might be, that could authorize you through the blockchain. There might be a sort of digital way to handle that approval process, but maybe that's one for the future. Are you going to play this sample, or is
I
your
can try?
intention
Yeah. Let's give it a go.
Give it a go, yeah.
Oh, it's going to be very loud, but let's see. Skip along.
The young, they can never become what they aspire to.
You can't hear
Born in
it,
a cell with no one who can inspire you.
Your highs are as never as high as those that lie to you.
Pretending that they live in the sky, lying behind you.
You can hear it there. It's so,
Shooting holes
so
up at your
convincing.
ceiling.
And they're riffing off each other, so it's like the main artist goes, the lead artist, and then Jay-Z's doing some stuff in the background, but it's just so convincing. From what I understand, I think Marcus Brownlee might have even done a bit on this. There was a bit of back and forth with the generation to try and get them to do phrases correctly, because sometimes he would say the same word in slightly different ways when they were generating it, so that there was lots of tweaking involved and lots of correction and stuff afterwards. But just goes to show how convincing it can be when you're using an artist's voice like Jay-Z over AI. It's absolutely wild. I know you couldn't hear it, but I'll give you a listen afterwards.
That's fine. But there was recently a DJ, wasn't there, as well, that did something similar with Eminem's voice at a concert. He used it live, AI generated lyrics that he got Eminem's likeness to sing, and he used it in an event. And there was a whole load of furore around whether or not he had the rights to do that, because they said, well, he's not using it to create content. He's not selling the content with this artist's voice on and making money directly off it. He's used it as part of a set that he's done at a DJ event. Is that acceptable? Has he infringed on the copyright there? Is that an acceptable use of his likeness? So, yeah, in your example, like you said, Jay-Z approved it. I don't think Eminem did in this particular example, but I don't know how that resolved itself in the end, or what the outcome was for that particular case. But anyway, we've gone really long, and we could talk about this subject for hours, and we'll probably do another podcast again. Maybe we'll do one in another 10 weeks, Robbie, and see how much more has changed again, and we'll see how many episodes we can do of generative AI this year. But I think we'll call it a day there. So thank you, everyone, for sticking with us this long. If you haven't already, please do all the usual things. Subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast service. Hop on over to YouTube if you're not there already. Subscribe and give this video a like. It really does help with the channel and boosting numbers and kind of getting us out there. Please share it with anyone you think might find this interesting. Please share the link and let them listen to us ramble about generative AI for a little over an hour. We also do stream content on Twitch, so if you want to join us over there, we are often playing old or new games, and sometimes doing other just sort of in real life chats or catch-ups. Or this week I'm going to be attempting to learn Blender, so if you want to come and watch me make a hash of that, then feel free to join. But otherwise, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again on our next episode.